The Vampire King found a homeless girl curled in the back seat of his Bentley at 3 a.m., rain drumming on bulletproof glass. She didn't flinch when he opened the door. Instead, she whispered 7 words in a dead language only his bloodline knew, words that named him responsible for a debt 4 centuries old, and he dropped to one knee on wet asphalt because ancient law gave him no choice. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The Vampire King knelt on rain-slicked asphalt at 3 in the morning, his body obeying laws older than the concrete beneath his knees, and the shock of it cut through 4 centuries of control like a blade through silk. Rain hammered the empty parking structure in sheets, turning the city above into fractured smears of neon and glass. And somewhere 14 floors up, his penthouse waited with its bulletproof windows and temperature-controlled silence. But here in the belly of the tower, he was on his knees before a homeless girl who smelled like wet cardboard and desperation. She sat in the back seat of his Bentley, legs tucked under a threadbare coat, hollow eyes watching him with something that looked like terror wearing exhaustion's face, and her fingers clutched a tarnished silver locket so tightly her knuckles had gone bone white. The Vampire King had opened the car door expecting a vagrant, maybe a junkie using his vehicle as shelter, something he could handle with a glare and a call to security. But instead she had lifted her head and whispered 7 words in a language dead before Rome fell, words that turned his blood to ice and his legs to water. He tried to resist, felt his muscles lock in furious denial, but ancient magic cared nothing for his will, and his knee hit wet asphalt, hard enough to split mortal skin. The girl flinched when he knelt, but did not run, and that told him she was either too exhausted to move or too ignorant to understand what those words meant, what they had just done to the most powerful vampire in the city. He rose slowly, rain soaking through his coat, jaw so tight his teeth ached, and his voice came out cold enough to frost glass when he told her to get out of the car. She shook her head, a tiny motion, and the locket swung from her trembling fingers like a pendulum counting down to some catastrophe he could not yet name. "You owe my bloodline protection until the last star fades," she said, and her voice cracked on the word protection like she had never spoken it aloud before, like she did not quite believe it applied to her. The Vampire King stared at the locket, at the way tarnish had eaten into the silver's scrollwork, and recognition hit him with the force of a freight train because he had seen that pattern before in his grandfather's private study, in drawings locked in vaults no one had opened in 200 years. "Where did you get that locket?" he asked, and his voice could have cut diamonds, could have drawn blood from stone. "My grandmother," the girl said, and her fingers would not stop shaking, would not release their death grip on the only thing she owned that mattered. "She said you would have no choice." The Vampire King felt something crack in his chest, some carefully maintained wall between past and present, because 4 centuries ago, his grandfather had saved a human family from a purge, had signed a protection pact in blood and starlight, with witnesses who were dust now, witnesses who had sworn to honor a debt that should have died with them. The family had vanished into history, their line lost or extinct, and the pact had been buried in archives no one accessed, a footnote in a war everyone wanted to forget. Until now. Until this hollow-eyed girl crawled into his car seeking warmth and spoke words that should not exist outside moldering paper and his own fragmented memories. "The debt," she repeated, and the word hung between them like a noose, like a crown, like a key to a door he had spent lifetimes keeping locked. Rain dripped from the Bentley's open door, pooling on leather seats worth more than most people earned in a year, and the girl sat there shivering in clothes that had not been washed in weeks, maybe months. Her face gaunt with hunger and sleepless nights, and a kind of feral wariness that came from surviving on streets that ate people alive. The Vampire King wanted to tell her she was wrong, that the locket was a fake or a coincidence, that no debt could span 400 years and still carry weight. But ancient law did not care what he wanted, and his body had already answered for him when it dropped to its knees without permission. Security cameras blinked red in the corners of the parking structure. Silent witnesses recording every frame, and he would have to scrub the footage before dawn, would have to erase evidence that the Vampire King had knelt before anyone, let alone a nameless human girl with nothing to her name but a dead woman's heirloom. The interior light of the Bentley cast her face in cold white, every hollow too sharp, every shadow too deep, and his own shadow swallowed the space between them until she looked like something carved from ice and desperation. She met his eyes and did not look away, and the Vampire King realized with a jolt that she was terrified, absolutely paralyzed with fear. But she was not running, and she was not begging, and that made her either incredibly brave or too broken to care about survival. He suspected the latter. Her coat dripped rainwater onto his upholstery, cheap synthetic fabric that had soaked through hours ago, and beneath it, he could see layers of clothing worn for warmth rather than fashion, shirts over a frame so thin he could probably count her ribs. She looked 19, maybe 20, but the streets aged people, and he could not be certain, could not read her the way he read his own kind with their static faces and immortal tells. What he could read was exhaustion, the kind that went bone deep, the kind that came from months or years of sleeping in alleys and doorways, and the back seats of cars that did not belong to her. 3 days, he thought. That was what she had said. 3 days since her grandmother died, and pressed this locket into her palm with instructions that sounded like desperation or madness. Say them to the Night King when you have nothing left. The old woman must have known, must have carried the knowledge of the pact through generations, waiting for the moment when her bloodline would need it, and that moment had come in the form of a dying woman and a homeless girl with nowhere else to turn. The Vampire King felt fury rising in his throat, cold and clean, fury at his grandfather for making promises that outlived common sense, fury at this girl for invoking them, fury at himself for the flicker of shame that had crossed his face when she spoke, because some part of him, some part he had buried under centuries of pragmatism and ruthless control, remembered what honor meant. The locket swung between them, tarnished silver, catching the Bentley's interior light, and he could see now that it was old, genuinely old, the kind of craftsmanship that had died with the Industrial Revolution. It had been passed down, hand to hand, grandmother to granddaughter, a relic carried through poverty and obscurity, and the kind of forgetting that erased families from history. Except this family had not been forgotten, not entirely, because someone had carved those 7 words inside the locket's casing, someone had taught them pronunciation, someone had kept the pact alive, even when the world moved on. The Vampire King felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like chains, like a crown he had not asked for, because ancient law was absolute and he had knelt, and that meant the debt was real, was enforceable, was his to carry whether he wanted it or not. He looked at the girl and saw not a threat but a problem. A complication that would unravel carefully maintained political balance, because if the council learned he had invoked a pact from the forgotten registry, they would demand explanations he could not give, would drag both of them before elders who remembered the purges and the blood and the reasons those pacts had been buried in the first place. Rain hammered the concrete above them, a rhythm like gunfire, like a heartbeat, like a countdown to something inevitable, and the Vampire King made a decision that would fracture his life into before and after. "Get in the front seat," he said, and his voice was flat, empty of inflection, a tone he used when emotion was liability. "We need to talk somewhere without cameras." The girl hesitated, fingers still locked on the locket, and he could see her weighing risks. Trying to calculate whether obeying him was more dangerous than refusing, but exhaustion won over caution, and she climbed out of the back seat and into the front, moving like her joints hurt, like gravity was too heavy. The Vampire King slid behind the wheel, closed the door, and the silence inside the Bentley was sudden and absolute, rain reduced to white noise against bulletproof glass. He started the engine, pulled out of the parking space, and drove toward the exit ramp, his mind already 3 moves ahead, already calculating how to contain this, how to protect them both from the consequences of a debt 4 centuries old, coming due in the middle of a city that had no tolerance for the past, intruding on its cold neon present. The Vampire King took Mara to his penthouse not out of kindness but because the debt required her to be sheltered under his roof and shadow, and those words had specific legal meaning in vampire law, meaning she could not be housed elsewhere, could not be sent to a hotel or safe house, had to occupy space he controlled directly. The elevator rose so fast her ears popped, and when the doors opened onto his private floor, she stepped into a space that felt more like a museum than a home, all glass and steel and cold modernist elegance, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that made her feel like she was floating above the world rather than living in it. Heated floors radiated warmth through her wet shoes, the first real heat she had felt in weeks, and the shock of it nearly brought tears to her eyes, but she blinked them back because crying felt dangerous here, felt like showing weakness to a predator who had not yet decided whether to honor the debt or find a loophole. The Vampire King walked through the space without looking at it, the way people moved through places they had stopped seeing years ago, and he pointed to a hallway on the left and told her the second door was hers, that she should not leave the apartment, that he had work to do. Then he disappeared into what she assumed was his study and closed the door with a finality that said she was dismissed, forgotten, a problem shelved for later consideration. Mara stood in the center of the living room and tried to process the sheer size of it, the way the furniture looked expensive but unused, the way everything gleamed with the kind of cleanliness that required staff she had not seen and probably never would. She walked to her assigned room and found it larger than any place she had ever slept, with a bed that could fit 4 people and windows that overlooked the city's glittering sprawl. And on the bed, someone had laid out clothes, tailored and expensive and completely wrong sizes, like they had been guessed at by someone who had never looked at her closely. She touched the fabric and it felt like silk, like money, like a life she had only seen through shop windows and television screens. The bathroom attached to the room had marble counters and a shower with 6 different heads, and Mara stood under water so hot it turned her skin pink and scrubbed 2 weeks of street grime off her body until the drain ran gray. She washed her hair 3 times, used soap that smelled like lavender instead of the industrial lye from shelters, and when she finally stepped out and wrapped herself in a towel that was somehow heated, she felt like a different person, like someone who might deserve to be in a place like this. The clothes did not fit well, the pants too long and the shirt too loose, but they were clean and soft, and she put them on anyway, rolled the cuffs, tried not to think about how much they probably cost. She wandered the apartment because the Vampire King had told her not to leave, but had not told her to stay in her room. And curiosity was stronger than caution, stronger than the voice in her head that said she should make herself small and invisible the way she always did when occupying space that did not belong to her. She found a kitchen that looked like it had never been used, all stainless steel and granite, and when she opened the refrigerator she found medical bags filled with blood, labeled and dated like someone's meal prep, and it should have horrified her, should have sent her running. But instead she felt a strange kinship because they were both surviving on what the world left behind, both taking what others discarded or donated, both living on the margins in different ways. She closed the refrigerator and kept exploring, found a living room with furniture arranged for conversation that never happened, a dining table set for 12 that had probably never seen a meal, and then she found the photographs. They covered one entire wall, black and white and sepia and early color, spanning what looked like centuries, and in every single one, the Vampire King stood alone, always severe, always composed, his face unchanging while the world transformed around him. She saw him in Victorian formal wear, in 1920s suits, in wartime uniforms, in the cold minimalism of the modern era, and in none of them did he smile, in none of them did anyone stand beside him, and Mara realized with a jolt that he had been alone for a very long time, that this apartment built for dozens housed only him, and now her. That whatever family or friends or companions he might have had once were gone, erased by time or choice, or something worse. She was still staring at the photographs when she heard the study door open and the Vampire King emerged carrying a leather-bound ledger that looked older than most countries, his face tight with fury barely leashed. And when he spoke, his voice could have cut glass. "Your ancestor," he said, "Elena Marinov. She was the daughter of a blacksmith my grandfather freed from a vampire hunting cult in 1624. The pact promised protection to her line in exchange for her silence. She kept the secret, you just weaponized it." Mara turned to face him and met his eyes without flinching, without apologizing, because she had spent her entire life apologizing for existing, and she was done. "I am homeless," she said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands wanted to shake. "I have nothing. If this is a weapon, it is the only one I have ever had." The Vampire King stared at her like he was trying to decide if she was brave or suicidal, and before he could answer, his phone rang, a sharp trill that cut through the silence. And he answered it with a clipped greeting that turned into a conversation Mara could only hear one side of. Someone had accessed restricted archives, triggered alarms, breached protocol that required council approval, and Mara watched the Vampire King's jaw tighten as he realized his search for information about the pact had just painted a target on both of them. He ended the call without saying goodbye, looked at Mara with something that might have been regret or calculation, and told her to get some sleep because tomorrow was going to be worse. She wanted to ask what worse meant, but exhaustion was catching up to her. Real exhaustion now that she was clean and warm and fed. And she went to her room and climbed into the bed that was too big and too soft and fell asleep before she could think about what came next. Morning arrived too soon, announced by the Vampire King knocking on her door and telling her to get dressed, that a courier had arrived. Mara pulled on the two large clothes and found him in the living room holding a cream-colored envelope sealed with black wax, and his face when he read the contents looked like he was watching something die. The council was demanding an explanation for invoking a pact buried in the forgotten registry, demanding proof the debt was valid, and if the Vampire King could not provide it, he would be charged with fraud, and Mara would be charged with coercion of a sovereign, and the penalty for both was execution. He told her she had two choices, that she could renounce the claim and disappear, vanish into whatever life she had before, with enough money to survive. Or she could stand before the council in 3 days and prove her bloodline, prove Elena Marinov existed, and the pact was real. Mara did not hesitate, did not weigh options or calculate odds, she just looked at the Vampire King and said, "She chose the council." "I have been invisible my whole life," she told him, and her voice did not waver. "At least this way, someone has to see me." The Vampire King's mouth twitched like he wanted to smile, but had forgotten how, like the muscles had atrophied from disuse, and he nodded once and told her they had work to do. They visited the city's vampire genealogist that afternoon, a woman named Constance, who was so old she had gone blind centuries ago, but moved through her archives like she could see every page, every binding, every word inscribed in iron gall ink on vellum that predated the printing press. Her vault was beneath a cathedral, accessed through a crypt that tourists never saw, and the space was all candlelight and shadows and the smell of old paper slowly turning to dust. Constance listened to the Vampire King's explanation with her head tilted like a bird, fingers trailing over ledgers that contained bloodlines going back to Rome and beyond, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft as moth wings. "Elena Marinov," she said, Yes, I have her, daughter of a blacksmith, married a merchant son in 1647, had 3 children. The line continues through the youngest daughter. She pulled records that confirmed it, birth certificates and marriage licenses and death records that traced the family forward through history, and Mara felt something loosen in her chest because it was real. She was real. Her family had existed and mattered enough to be written down. But then Constance's fingers stopped at 1887, and she frowned, the kind of frown that meant she had found something wrong, something missing. "The records stop here," Constance murmured. "A fire or a purge, something erased 3 generations. I have births but no deaths, marriages but no children. It is like they were simply removed from history." Without full proof, the council would reject the claim, would say the bloodline died out, and Mara was a fraud or a descendant of a different family entirely, and the Vampire King's face went very still in the way that meant he was thinking 3 moves ahead, calculating angles Mara could not see. They left the vault and emerged onto a street that was too quiet for midday, too empty, and Mara noticed him first. The man in the gray coat standing across the street near a shuttered bookstore, not moving, not looking away, just watching them with the kind of focus that made her skin crawl. The Vampire King noticed too, and his hand found the small of her back without asking permission, guiding her faster toward where his car was parked, and he leaned close enough that she could feel the cold radiating off his skin when he spoke. "We are being followed," he said quietly. "The council does not wait for trials when they want someone gone." Mara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept walking, kept her pace steady, tried not to look back at the man in the gray coat, who was not blinking, who was not breathing, who was definitely not human. They reached the Bentley, and the Vampire King opened her door, and she slid in, and he was behind the wheel, and pulling into traffic before she could ask what happened next, what came after being followed, what the council would do if they decided a trial was too risky. He drove in silence, checking mirrors, taking turns that made no sense until she realized he was making sure they were not being tailed, and only when he seemed satisfied did he head back toward the tower, back toward the penthouse that was shelter and prison both. That night Mara could not sleep, kept thinking about the man in the gray coat, and the missing records, and the fact that someone had erased 3 generations of her family like they had never existed, and she got up and found the Vampire King in his study, surrounded by papers. Ancient texts written in languages she did not recognize, and he looked up when she entered like he had been expecting her. She asked him why he lived alone in a tower built for dozens, asked about his grandfather and the old laws, and whether he believed the pact was real or just a legal technicality he was bound to honor. The Vampire King was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he would not answer. And then he told her his grandfather had believed in a world where vampires and humans could coexist, where the old laws protected rather than divided, and the pact with Elena Marinoff was part of that vision. But the vision died, the Vampire King said, his voice flat and empty. The laws remained, but their purpose was forgotten, buried in archives no one accessed, and what was meant to protect became a weapon, became leverage, became exactly what you used it for. Mara flinched at that, but did not look away, and she told him she was sorry. Sorry for invoking something he wanted to leave buried, sorry for dragging him into a fight that might get them both killed. The Vampire King shook his head once, sharp, and told her not to apologize, told her she did what she had to do to survive, and he would honor the debt because honor was the only thing separating him from the council members who erased families and rewrote history. Then he went back to his papers, and Mara went back to her room, and she lay awake listening to rain start up again against the windows, thinking about bloodlines and debts and the way some promises outlive the people who made them, binding the living to answer for the dead. They returned to the penthouse to find the door ajar, and Mara's stomach dropped before they even crossed the threshold, because doors like that, doors to places like this, did not stay unlocked by accident. The Vampire King put his arm out to stop her, went in first with movements so controlled they looked choreographed, and when he nodded that it was clear, she followed him into wreckage. Papers everywhere, scattered across heated floors like snow, filing cabinets overturned and drawers pulled out and contents dumped with the kind of thoroughness that spoke of professional search rather than random vandalism. Glass shattered near the windows, not the bulletproof exterior but interior panels, decorative pieces smashed with precision, and Mara saw books pulled from shelves and left spine-broken on the floor, photographs torn from the wall and examined and discarded. The Vampire King moved through the destruction with eerie calm, his face blank as stone, checking rooms with the systematic efficiency of someone cataloging damage rather than reacting to violation, and Mara trailed behind him, feeling her chest go tight because she knew what was missing before he said it. The locket was gone. She had left it in her room on the nightstand, the only thing she owned that mattered, and now the nightstand was overturned and the locket was nowhere, vanished into whoever had torn through this place like they owned it. Without the locket, she had no proof, no physical evidence of the pact, just her word and a family name that appeared in records that stopped mysteriously in 1887. And her word meant nothing against the Council's power to rewrite history. The Vampire King returned to the main room and stopped at his desk, and Mara saw him go very still in a way that meant he had found something important. An envelope sat in the center of the desk's mahogany surface, cream-colored, sealed with black wax, placed with deliberate care on top of the chaos like a calling card. He picked it up and turned it over, and Mara saw his jaw tighten before he broke the seal. And when he pulled out what was inside his hands, shook so faintly, she almost missed it. Almost thought she imagined it, because vampires did not shake, did not show weakness, did not let their control slip. A photograph, old enough to be a daguerreotype, the kind made with silver and mercury and time, and the Vampire King stared at it like he was seeing a ghost. He held it so Mara could see, and her breath stopped, because the woman in the photograph looked exactly like her, same hollow cheeks and sharp chin and eyes that held too much knowledge, standing beside a vampire Mara recognized from the penthouse wall, from the photographs spanning centuries. The vampire in the daguerreotype was younger than the one she knew, softer somehow, with something in his expression that looked almost like joy, and his arm was around the woman's shoulders in a way that spoke of intimacy, of belonging, of a connection that transcended the careful distance in every other photograph she had seen. The Vampire King turned the daguerreotype over and Mara read the words written in faded ink on the back, handwriting so old it was barely legible. Elena's granddaughter, Marie. She knew the price. We paid it so you would not have to. The Vampire King's voice when he spoke was so quiet, Mara had to lean closer to hear it, and the words came out slow, like he was pulling them from a place he had locked away for a very long time. Marie Marinov, he said. She was my brother's wife, human. The council executed them both in 1887 for breaking the separation law. No vampire may marry a human bloodline tied to old pacts. They called it corruption of sovereignty. He looked at Mara, and for the first time she saw his control crack completely, saw grief pour through the fractures like water through a dam that could not hold, and his eyes were old, so old, filled with a century and change of loss he had never processed because processing meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking. Your family did not disappear, he said, and his voice was raw now, stripped of the cold authority she had come to expect. They were erased, by the council, to bury the evidence that my family had honored the pact for 200 years. Mara felt like the floor had dropped out from under her, felt like gravity had reversed, and she was falling upward into sky, because this changed everything, reframed every assumption she had made about what the locket meant, and what the debt represented. She was not just invoking a forgotten agreement, she was resurrecting a scandal that had cost the Vampire King his brother, was dragging into light a murder the council had spent over a century concealing. They killed your brother because he loved my great-great-grandmother, she asked, and the question came out smaller than she intended, fragile as paper. The Vampire King set the photograph down carefully, like it might shatter, and when he answered, his voice was quiet and raw, and more honest than anything she had heard from him. They killed him because he proved the old laws still mattered, he said, and I have spent a century pretending they do not. Mara understood then, understood why he lived alone in a tower built for dozens, why every photograph showed him solitary and severe, why he had built his life around ruthless control and perfect obedience to laws he despised. He had survived by becoming exactly what the council wanted, by erasing every trace of the idealism that had gotten his brother killed, by making himself so valuable and so compliant they could not afford to destroy him. And now she had walked into his life with a locket and 7 words and forced him to choose between continued survival and the truth he had spent 138 years burying. The power flipped in that moment, shifted completely, because Mara had thought she was asking for help, thought she was a beggar invoking a debt out of desperation, but she was actually holding a sword to the council's throat. She was proof they had committed murder to hide corruption, proof the separation law was not about preserving vampire sovereignty, but about erasing evidence of their crimes, proof the council rewrote history to suit their narrative. And the Vampire King was not protecting her out of duty, or honor, or ancient obligation. He was protecting her because she was the last living witness to his brother's execution. The last thread connecting present to a past the council wanted dead and buried. Rain fell against the windows, turning the city outside into smears of neon and shadow, and Mara stood in the ransacked penthouse, feeling like she had just stepped into a story much larger and more dangerous than she had imagined. The locket's theft was not random vandalism, it was strategy, calculated to leave her arriving at trial empty-handed and discredited, her claims unsupported by physical evidence, easy to dismiss as the delusions of a homeless girl trying to con her way into vampire protection. But whoever had taken the locket had left the photograph, had placed it deliberately where the Vampire King would find it, and that meant someone wanted him to know, wanted him to remember, wanted to remind him of exactly what he had lost, and why. Mara watched the Vampire King pick up the daguerreotype again, watched his fingers trace the edge like he was touching something sacred, and she saw grief written in every line of his face, grief and rage and a century of suppressed feeling rising to the surface. She reached for his hand without thinking, without asking permission, just took it, because he looked like he was drowning, and she knew what drowning felt like, knew what it meant to go under and have no one notice you were gone. He let her, did not pull away, did not hide behind cold authority or practice distance, just held her hand like it was an anchor, keeping him from floating away into memory. "Tell me about him," Mara said, because she needed to know, needed to understand who Marie had been and who the Vampire King's brother had been and what kind of love was worth dying for. The Vampire King was quiet for a long time, staring at the photograph, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it, almost gentle. His name was Adrian, the Vampire King said. He was younger by 3 decades, believed vampires and humans could coexist, believed the old laws existed to protect rather than divide, believed love mattered more than sovereignty or bloodline purity. He met Marie at a theater, 1879. She was selling programs, and he was supposed to be meeting council members, but he saw her, and everything else stopped mattering. The Vampire King's thumb brushed across Marie's face in the photograph, a gesture so tender it made Mara's chest ache. They married in secret, he continued, invoked the protection pact so the union would be legal under old law, even if the council forbade it under new law, thought if they could prove the marriage worked, prove they could build a life together, the council would have to acknowledge that the separation law was based on fear rather than necessity. But the council did not want proof, the Vampire King said, and his voice went cold again, hard as iron. They wanted control, wanted to maintain the fiction that vampires and humans were fundamentally incompatible, that the old laws were dangerous relics that led to corruption, and Adrian and Marie were evidence against that narrative, so the council erased them, executed them both for corruption of sovereignty, burned their marriage records, destroyed every document proving the union existed, and purged 3 generations of Marinov family records to eliminate witnesses. Mara felt sick, felt rage building in her stomach like fire, because her family had been collateral damage in a political cover-up, erased not because they had done anything wrong, but because they knew something inconvenient. And the Vampire King had survived by never speaking of it, by letting his brother's death become a footnote no one examined, by building a life so controlled and isolated he never risked loving anyone enough to lose them the same way. "You have been alone for 138 years, Mara said, and it was not a question. The Vampire King nodded once, still holding her hand, still staring at the photograph like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the present. "I learned," he said quietly, "that caring about anything gives the council leverage, that the only way to survive is to become untouchable, to follow every law perfectly so they cannot justify removing me, to never let anyone close enough to be used against me." Until you, Mara thought, but did not say, because she understood now that her arrival had shattered his carefully constructed isolation, had forced him to choose between safety and truth, between survival and the brother he had spent over a century pretending to forget. The ransacked penthouse felt like a violation not just of space, but of the fragile détente the Vampire King had maintained with the council, and the photograph felt like a threat, a reminder that they knew about Adrian, knew about Marie, knew exactly which wounds to press to make him bleed. "We have 2 days until the trial," the Vampire King said, and his voice was steadying now, control reasserting itself even though his hand still held hers. "Without the locket, we need other evidence, need to prove your bloodline, and the pact's validity in ways they cannot dismiss or destroy. Constance has fragments, but we need more, need something concrete enough that even the council cannot deny it." Mara nodded, but her mind was spinning because she understood now that this trial was not about validating a debt. It was about forcing the council to publicly acknowledge a crime they had spent over a century concealing, and if they succeeded, the repercussions would fracture vampire society, would prove the council was capable of murder and historical erasure, would validate every suspicion the old law's supporters had harbored for generations. And if they failed, Mara and the Vampire King would both be executed, their deaths adding to a body count that started with Adrian and Marie and showed no signs of stopping. Rain drummed against bulletproof glass, and Mara stood in the wreckage holding the hand of a vampire who had been alone since before she was born, and she thought about Marie's words on the back of the photograph. She knew the price. "We paid it so you would not have to." But the price had not been paid, not really. It had just been deferred, passed down through generations until it landed on Mara's shoulders, along with a locket and 7 words in a dead language. And now she had to decide whether to run or fight, whether to let the past stay buried or drag it screaming into the light, no matter what it cost. The Vampire King called an emergency meeting with his few remaining allies at dawn in a shuttered opera house on the city's east side, a building that had been slated for demolition for 3 years, but somehow never quite made it to the wrecking ball, and Mara followed him through a service entrance that smelled like mildew and forgotten dreams. Light bled through boarded windows in thin golden bars, catching dust motes that hung suspended like they had been there since the last performance, and the interior was ghostly, velvet seats rotting in neat rows facing a stage empty except for shadows. 2 council members arrived first, both ancient enough that their faces had gone smooth as marble, expressions worn away by centuries, until only careful neutrality remained. And they nodded to the Vampire King with the kind of deference that spoke of debts owed and leverage held. The rogue vampire historian came last, a woman who looked barely 30, but moved like someone much older, carrying a leather satchel that clinked with the sound of glass vials and probably contained evidence the council would kill to suppress. The Vampire King laid everything out on the stage under pale light. The daguerreotype photograph of Marie and Adrian, fragments of genealogy records Constance had copied in her precise, archaic script, and the cream-colored envelope with its black wax seal that he had matched to a current council elder through heraldry databases no one was supposed to access. His allies examined the evidence in silence, passing pieces between them like they were handling explosives, and Mara watched from the shadows of the orchestra pit, making herself small the way she had learned on the streets, invisible until she chose otherwise. The first council member, a vampire with silver hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, spoke in a whisper that somehow carried through the empty opera house. "If you accuse the council of murder at trial," she said, "they will execute you both before you finish speaking. This is not evidence. This is a death sentence." The historian nodded, fingers tracing the daguerreotype's edge, and offered an alternative, her voice steady and pragmatic. "Go public," she said. "Leak the evidence to human media, to vampire reputation networks, to every outlet that will listen. Force the council to respond in the open, where they cannot simply disappear witnesses, make it too visible to bury." Mara listened and felt the scale of what they were fighting shift in her mind, expand beyond a legal case about a debt into something much larger, something that could fracture vampire society if it broke the right way. This was not about her survival anymore. It was about forcing truth into a system built on concealment, about proving the council was capable of murder and historical erasure, about validating every suspicion that the separation law was not protection, but control. And she was the spark, the homeless girl with a locket who had stumbled into a revolution without meaning to, who had invoked a debt thinking only of shelter, and found herself holding evidence of atrocity. The Vampire King refused the leak plan with a shake of his head, jaw tight, voice flat and final. "I will not let her become a martyr," he said. "There has to be another way. We cannot build a new world on her corpse." His allies exchanged glances that said they thought he was letting emotion cloud judgment, that they did not understand why he was risking everything for a human girl he had known less than a week. And Mara realized they were right not to understand because even she did not fully understand, could not name what was building between her and the Vampire King, except that it felt like recognition, like two people who had been invisible their whole lives learning to see each other. She stepped forward out of the shadows, into the light bleeding through boarded windows, and every vampire in the room turned to look at her with the kind of focus that made her skin crawl. "What if I testify?" she asked, and her voice was smaller than she wanted, but it did not shake. "Not about the debt, about what the council did to my family, make them answer for Marie, make them explain why 3 generations of records just vanish in 1887. The room went silent, the kind of silence that felt like held breath, and the Vampire King looked at her like she had just volunteered for a firing squad, like he was watching her die in real time. "You do not know what you are asking," he said quietly. "Testimony rights mean you can speak, but they do not mean anyone will listen. Cross-examination from council elders is designed to break witnesses, to discredit them so thoroughly their words become meaningless, you will be torn apart." Mara met his eyes and did not look away, thought about a lifetime of being invisible, of sleeping in alleys and shelters, of social workers and cops and passers-by who looked through her like she was transparent. "I have been erased my whole life," she said, and this time her voice did not waver at all. "Let me be seen before I am gone." The Vampire King's face did something complicated, grief and fury and reluctant admiration fighting for space, and he nodded once, sharp, like he was making a decision that would haunt him. His allies left shortly after, slipping out through different exits, their sympathy clear, but their support limited because they had their own survival to consider, their own positions to protect, and Mara understood that she and the Vampire King were functionally alone in this, that whatever happened at trial, they would face it with no safety net. They had 48 hours until the council session, and the Vampire King used every minute training Mara in protocol, in the formal language required to address elders, in how to invoke testimony rights without giving them legal grounds to silence her, in how to survive cross-examination that would probe every weakness and exploit every gap in her knowledge. She was a fast study, memorized the formulas he taught her, practiced staying calm when he played the role of hostile questioner and attacked her story from every angle. But she was also fragile in ways that had nothing to do with intelligence or courage. She had not eaten regularly in months, had not slept without fear in years, and her body was running on reserves that were nearly empty. Adrenaline and desperation keeping her upright when nutrition and rest would have been wiser foundations. The Vampire King noticed and started keeping human food in the penthouse, real food, instead of the untouched contents of a refrigerator that had been decorative until now, and he reminded her to eat, to rest, stood guard outside her door at night like he expected another breach. Mara asked him once why he cared, why he was investing so much in keeping her alive when it would be easier to let her renounce the claim and disappear, and he did not answer, just looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and lost too many people, and she found a blanket tucked around her shoulders the next morning when she woke on the couch after falling asleep reviewing council hierarchy. The night before trial, Mara could not sleep, kept running through testimony in her head, kept imagining 100 ways it could go wrong, and she was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when she heard a sound from the hallway, something too quiet to be the Vampire King moving through his own space. She got up and opened her door a crack, and saw a figure in black at the end of the hall, moving toward the Vampire King's study, with the kind of silence that spoke of professional training, and her breath stopped, because she knew what this was. Knew an assassin when she saw one, even if she had never seen one before. She should have stayed in her room, should have hidden and let the Vampire King handle it, but instead she stepped into the hallway just as the Vampire King emerged from his study, and everything happened very fast. The assassin moved first, inhumanly quick, blade flashing in cold fluorescent light, and the Vampire King was faster, caught the wrist and twisted, and there was a crack like breaking wood that was actually breaking bone. The fight lasted maybe 10 seconds, brutal and silent and efficient, the Vampire King moving with a precision that looked choreographed, but was actually centuries of experience distilled into muscle memory. And when it ended, the assassin was dead on white marble, with blood spreading in a pool so vivid it looked artificial. The Vampire King stood over the body breathing hard, not from exertion, but from adrenaline or rage or something else, and he pulled a monogrammed handkerchief from his pocket and wiped blood off his hands with movements that were too controlled, too precise, like he was holding himself together through ritual. His shoulders stayed rigid even after the threat was gone, tension locked in every line of his body, and Mara understood that this was not the first time he had killed someone in this penthouse, not the first time he had cleaned up a council-sent message written in violence. She walked to him without thinking, crossed the hallway in bare feet, stepped around the spreading blood, and touched his wrist where the handkerchief had not quite cleaned all the red away. "You do not have to do this alone anymore," she said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands wanted to shake, even though there was a corpse 5 feet away, and she should probably be screaming. The Vampire King looked at her, really looked, the way you look at someone you are about to lose, someone you want to memorize before they are taken, and his voice when he spoke was quiet and raw and absolutely certain. "If the council takes you tomorrow," he said, "I will burn their hall to the ground. I will tear down every elder who voted for your execution. I will make them regret they ever touched you." It was not a threat, not bravado, just a promise delivered in a tone that said he had already calculated the cost and decided it was worth paying, and Mara believed him completely. She believed he would burn the world for her if the council took her, believed he would spend the next century dismantling everything they had built, believed she had become something more to him than a debt or an obligation or a problem to be managed. The intimacy between them had shifted. deepened into something that was not romance exactly, but was recognition. Two people who had been invisible their whole lives, finally seeing each other clearly, understanding what it meant to matter to someone after a lifetime of being dismissed. The Vampire King called his security team to handle the body, to scrub the hallway, to upgrade every defensive measure in the penthouse, because if the council sent one assassin, they would send more. And Mara stood beside him while he issued orders in a voice that had gone cold and commanding again. But his hand found hers while he talked, fingers threading through hers, like he needed the anchor, needed proof she was still there, and alive and real. And she held on, because she needed the same thing, needed to know she was not facing tomorrow alone. They spent the rest of the night in the living room, sitting on the couch with dawn approaching. Not talking much, but not needing to, just existing in the same space while the city outside started to wake. The Vampire King told her about Adrian at some point, voice soft in the pre-dawn quiet, told her his brother had believed in a world where love mattered more than law, where connection was stronger than sovereignty, where vampires and humans could build lives together if only the council would stop insisting it was impossible. The council made an example of him, the Vampire King said. Executed him and Marie in front of witnesses to prove what happened when you defied the separation law. And I survived by becoming exactly what they wanted, obedient and isolated and useful, by never giving them reason to question my loyalty. Until now, Mara thought. Until a homeless girl crawled into your car and spoke 7 words that forced you to choose between safety and truth, between survival and the brother you spent 138 years pretending to forget. The sun rose slowly, turning the sky from black to gray to pale gold, and Mara watched light creep across the floor and thought about Marie's words on the back of the daguerreotype. She knew the price. We paid it so you would not have to. But prices like that did not get paid once, they got paid over and over, passed through generations until someone decided to stop paying, to stand up and say the cost was too high, the injustice too great, the silence too damaging. And maybe that someone was her. Maybe that was why her grandmother had kept the locket and taught her the words. Maybe that was why she had ended up in the Vampire King's Bentley at 3 in the morning with rain drumming on bulletproof glass. The Vampire King's hand tightened on hers as full daylight arrived, and he told her they should try to rest, that the trial started at sunset, and they needed whatever strength they could gather. But neither of them moved. Neither of them wanted to let go, and they sat together watching the city wake while the clock counted down to a confrontation that would either validate 138 years of injustice or add their names to the list of people the council had erased. The council chamber was carved from black granite 3 centuries ago by vampires who believed in permanence, in weight, in the kind of authority that pressed down on you like the ceiling might collapse at any moment. And Mara felt that weight as soon as she crossed the threshold with the Vampire King at her side. Iron chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, flames that had burned for 300 years without extinguishing, casting cold light that made everyone look like corpses. And the 12 elders sat in a crescent facing the center of the room, where supplicants stood to be judged. Galleries rose on either side, packed with vampire aristocracy who had come to watch a homeless girl challenge the council, their faces pale and perfect, and utterly still, except for eyes that tracked every movement, like predators deciding whether something was prey or threat. Mara wore a dress the Vampire King had commissioned overnight, deep blue silk tailored to fit her exactly, simple lines that looked elegant rather than ostentatious, armor disguised as formal wear, and she held herself straight, even though her legs wanted to shake because she understood this was theater, performance, and showing fear would be blood in water. The Vampire King walked beside her in a black suit that probably cost more than a car. His face carved from ice, hand not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his skin. And when they reached the center of the chamber, he positioned himself slightly in front of her, a wall of silent protection that the elders noted with narrowed eyes. The head elder called the session to order with a strike of his gavel that echoed like a gunshot, and Mara forced herself to breathe slowly, to keep her heartbeat steady, even though adrenaline was screaming through her veins. The charges were read in a voice that made them sound like historical fact rather than accusation. Mara Maranov invoked a fraudulent pact to coerce sovereign protection. The vampire king violated protocol by sheltering a human without council clearance, recommended sentence nullification of claim, exile for the girl, censure for the vampire king. Mara heard the words and understood they were designed to sound reasonable, measured, the kind of judgment that protected vampire society from manipulation and preserved order, except the order they were preserving was built on murder and historical erasure and lies that had lasted 138 years. The vampire king invoked right of evidence before the head elder could move to sentencing, his voice cutting through the chamber with the kind of authority that came from centuries of commanding rooms exactly like this one, and he presented everything they had prepared: the daguerreotype photograph of Marie and Adrian, genealogy fragments from Constance proving the Maranov line, a timeline that showed the family's records stopping abruptly in 1887. The council listened in stony silence, faces revealing nothing, and Mara watched the elders examine each piece of evidence with the kind of clinical detachment that said they had already decided the outcome and were simply going through motions for appearance's sake. The head elder spoke after a pause calculated to suggest careful consideration, and his voice was smooth as silk over steel. "This evidence proves only that a human named Marie Maranov existed," he said. "It does not prove a valid pact, nor does it justify your gross breach of protocol. The photograph could depict anyone, the genealogy records are incomplete, and invoking the forgotten registry without council authorization is itself grounds for sanction." The vampire king's jaw tightened, and Mara saw fury flash across his face before control reasserted itself, saw him realize they were losing, that the council had no intention of acknowledging evidence that contradicted their narrative. Mara stood before he could respond, before she could think better of it, before fear could stop her, and her voice came out clear and steady when she spoke the words the vampire king had taught her. "I invoke right of testimony." The chamber froze, every vampire going utterly still. And Mara felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her because humans almost never spoke at council sessions, almost never claimed testimony rights, and those who did rarely survived the experience because cross-examination was designed to destroy rather than illuminate. The head elder's smile was thin as a knife blade, amused and contemptuous in equal measure, and when he granted permission, his voice dripped with condescension. "Speak, child." Mara ignored the tone and told the story exactly as she and the vampire king had practiced, not the debt, but the erasure. Her grandmother's stories about a family that vanished, about a locket passed down through generations with whispered warnings about a night king and protection that lasted until stars faded. She named Marie Maranov, her great-great-grandmother, a woman who had fallen in love with a vampire in 1879 and married him in secret. She named Adrian, the vampire king's brother, younger and idealistic and convinced that love could bridge the gap between species. And then she pulled a folded paper from her sleeve, hands steady even though her heart was hammering, and held it up so the entire chamber could see the official seal at the top. A death certificate from 1887, cause of death listed as judicial execution for corruption of blood, signed by 12 council elders, including 3 who sat in this chamber right now. She found it in Constance's vault, buried in unmarked files that were supposed to have been destroyed, preserved by an archivist who believed history mattered more than politics. "You did not just erase my family," Mara said, and she looked directly at the head elder, met his eyes without flinching. "You murdered them for loving each other, executed them under a law designed to maintain separation, and you have spent 138 years lying about it, rewriting history so no one would know the separation law was enforced through murder." The chamber erupted like a dam breaking, vampires shouting and elders calling for order, and the galleries descending into chaos as aristocrats who had come expecting a simple trial suddenly found themselves witnessing an accusation of historical atrocity. The head elder's face went white with rage, bloodless and terrible, and he slammed his gavel hard enough to crack the podium. "This testimony is sedition," he roared. "The girl will be detained pending investigation of slander against the council." Guards moved forward from the walls, vampires in formal black with hands on weapons, and the vampire king stepped between Mara and them with a movement so fast it blurred, his hand going to his belt where Mara suddenly realized he was armed, had come to this trial ready to fight his way out if necessary. Violence hung in the air like static before a lightning strike, and Mara understood with perfect clarity that people were about to die, that the vampire king would kill every guard in this room before he let them take her, and the council would use that violence to justify executing them both. But before anyone could move, before the first blow could fall, a voice cut through the chaos with the kind of authority that came from age beyond measure. "I have the original pact." Every head turned toward the gallery entrance where Constance stood, the blind archivist who should not have been here, who had risked everything by coming. And in her hands she held a rolled parchment that looked older than countries. "Signed in blood and starlight 1624, witnessed by 16 elders including 3 who still sit in this chamber," she continued, and her voice was steady as stone. "The debt is valid. The girl is under sovereign protection, and if you execute her, you violate your own law. You become exactly what you claim to prevent: corruption and chaos masquerading as order." The room went silent, absolute silence, the kind that felt like the world holding its breath, and Constance walked forward through the crowd that parted for her like water, her footsteps echoing on granite. And she placed the parchment on the central podium with a gentleness that suggested it might crumble if handled roughly. The vampire king met her eyes, and something passed between them. Gratitude or recognition or understanding, and Constance nodded once and left without waiting to see what happened next, because she had done what she came to do, and staying would only make her a target. The head elder unrolled the parchment with hands that shook, rage or fear, Mara could not tell, and she watched his face collapse as he read words written 400 years ago in ink made from vampire blood and human sweat. The pact was real, validated by signatures that included his own name in handwriting he could not deny, proof he had witnessed the agreement, and then spent over a century pretending it did not exist. The scandal was not just historical, it was present, ongoing, provable, because 3 current elders had participated in burying evidence they were legally bound to uphold, had conspired to erase a family to hide their complicity in murder that violated the very laws they claimed to enforce. The vampire king moved to stand beside the head elder, leaned close enough that his words would not carry beyond the podium, and Mara saw the elder flinch like he had been struck. "You have 2 choices," the vampire king said quietly, and his voice was soft as silk and hard as iron. "Acknowledge the debt publicly, clear Mara's name, and resign in disgrace, or I release this to every vampire network and human media outlet before dawn, and you face treason charges, execution, and the complete dismantling of your legacy." The head elder closed his eyes like he was watching his own death, and when he opened them again, he looked 1,000 years old, ancient and broken and defeated. "The debt is valid," he said to the chamber, and his voice had lost all its authority, come out flat and hollow. "The girl is under sovereign protection. This session is adjourned." Mara nearly collapsed with relief, felt her knees go weak, and the vampire king's hand found her elbow steadying her before she could fall. The gallery emptied quickly, aristocrats fleeing like they did not want to be associated with what had just happened, and the elders filed out in silence, leaving only Mara and the vampire king standing in the center of the black granite chamber. Victory tasted like ashes in Mara's mouth, because her family was still dead, Marie and Adrian were still executed, and the council members who had ordered their deaths would resign but face no real punishment, would retire to private estates and live out eternity in comfort while the people they murdered stayed buried. Justice was partial at best, incomplete, a stalemate bought with Constance's risk and the Vampire King's willingness to destroy his own political standing, and Mara understood they had not won so much as survived, had forced the council to acknowledge truth, but could not undo the damage that truth revealed. The Vampire King guided her out of the chamber and back to his car, and they drove through the city in silence while night fell around them, streetlights painting the world in amber and shadow. Mara's hands would not stop shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Now that her body remembered she had just stood before 12 elders and accused them of murder, had invoked testimony rights, and survived cross-examination, and walked out alive when so many others had not. The Vampire King noticed and reached across the console to take her hand, his skin cold but his grip steady, and they sat like that while he drove, connected by touch, by shared trauma, by the understanding that they had crossed a line tonight and could never go back. The penthouse felt different when they returned, less like a fortress and more like a tomb, and Mara wandered to the windows overlooking the city, while the Vampire King poured himself blood from medical bags that seemed obscene after everything they had just been through. She thought about Marie's words on the daguerreotype, about prices paid so future generations would not have to, except the price had not prevented anything, had just deferred the cost, and now Mara was marked. Now the Vampire King had made permanent enemies. Now the council's corruption was wounded, but not dead, and would be looking for ways to finish what the trial had interrupted. The Vampire King joined her at the window, and they stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the city breathe, watching traffic flow, and lights blink, and ordinary people live ordinary lives, unaware that tonight history had shifted, that evidence of murder had been dragged into light, that the council's claim to moral authority had fractured even if it had not broken completely. "We made them see," the Vampire King said quietly, his reflection ghostly in bulletproof glass. "We made them acknowledge what they did, made them speak the truth even if they will never face real consequences. And that matters, that changes things, even if it does not feel like victory." Mara nodded because she understood what he meant, but also understood that acknowledgement without accountability was hollow, that Marie and Adrian were still dead and would stay dead, that her family was still erased, and the 3 generations of missing records would never be recovered. But she had been seen, had stood in front of the council and spoken and survived, had claimed space in a room that was designed to erase people like her. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was the victory her grandmother had imagined when she passed down the locket and the words. The Vampire King's hand found hers again, and they stood together while the city turned below them. 2 people who had been invisible learning what it meant to be witnessed, to matter, to fight for truth, even when truth could not bring back the dead. And somewhere in the penthouse, half hidden under new paperwork on the Vampire King's desk, a file marked separation law, pending repeal, waited for morning, waited for the work that came after survival, waited for them to decide whether partial victory was enough or just the beginning of something larger. Dawn broke over the city in layers of gold and rose, light spilling across glass towers that caught fire in the early sun, and Mara stood on the penthouse balcony, breathing air scrubbed clean by rain that had finally stopped, leaving the world sharp-edged and new. The Vampire King stood beside her close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his skin, and they watched the city wake in silence, watched traffic begin to flow and windows light up, and ordinary people start ordinary days unaware that the council was fracturing, that 3 elders had resigned in the night, that Constance was in hiding somewhere the council could not reach, that formal acknowledgement of the pact was being drafted in legal language designed to obscure as much as it revealed. Mara should have felt victorious, should have felt the rush of winning against impossible odds, but instead she felt hollow, emptied out, because victory had not brought back the dead, had not undone 138 years of injustice, had only forced acknowledgement without delivering accountability. "They are still dead," she said quietly, and her voice was small against the vast sky. "Marie, your brother, we did not save them." The Vampire King was silent for a long moment, staring at the horizon where the sun was climbing, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it, gentler, like he was handling something fragile. "No," he said, "but we made sure they are remembered. We dragged their names back into light. We forced the council to admit what they did, even if we could not make them pay for it, and that is not nothing. Remembering matters when the alternative is erasure." Mara nodded because she understood what he meant, even if it did not fill the hollow place in her chest, understood that bearing witness was its own kind of justice when systemic justice was impossible, that speaking names was power when the powerful wanted those names forgotten. The Vampire King reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the locket. Tarnished silver catching dawn light, and Mara gasped because she had thought it was gone, lost in the council vault or destroyed to eliminate evidence, but here it was in his hand being offered back to her. He recovered it during the chaos after the trial, slipped into the vault while guards were distracted and elders were fleeing, and he placed it in her palm with a care that suggested it was more precious than the building they stood in. She opened it and found the original inscription still there, the 7 words in the dead language that had started everything. But beside it was something new, a photograph printed on modern paper, her and the Vampire King standing side by side during the trial, taken by a security camera at the moment right after she invoked testimony rights. She did not know when he had gotten the image or why he had added it to the locket, did not understand what it meant that he had placed her beside the words that bound him, but looking at it made her chest ache with something that was not quite pain and not quite hope. "The debt is fulfilled," the Vampire King said, and his voice was careful, controlled, like he was afraid of what came next. "You are free to go. I will arrange housing, funds, whatever you need to build a life. You owe me nothing, and I owe you nothing, and the pact is satisfied." Mara looked at him and saw fear behind the careful control, saw hope buried so deep he probably did not recognize it himself, saw a man who had been alone for 138 years offering freedom because he thought that was what she wanted, what she deserved, even though letting her go would cost him everything he had started to rebuild. "What if I do not want to go?" she asked, and her voice was steady even though her heart was hammering. The Vampire King's expression cracked, control fracturing to reveal something raw and vulnerable and terrifying in its intensity, hope and fear, and something too fragile to name fighting for space on a face that had forgotten how to show emotion. "Then stay," he said, and the words came out rough, like they hurt. "Not because of the debt, not because you owe me anything, but because I am asking, because I want you here, because I have been alone for so long. I forgot what it meant to have someone see me, until you looked at me in that parking garage and spoke words that should not exist." Mara smiled, small and real, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself since her grandmother died, since the world became a place of impossible choices, and ancient laws and vampires who knelt on wet asphalt. "I will stay," she said, and the relief that crossed the Vampire King's face was so profound it looked like pain, like grief reversed, like something locked inside him for over a century, suddenly breaking free. She leaned against the balcony railing and looked out at the city sprawling below, millions of people living millions of lives, and for the first time in her entire existence, she was not invisible, was not erased, was not a problem to be managed or a burden to be tolerated. She was seen, chosen, wanted, and the weight of that was almost too much to bear, except the Vampire King was beside her, shoulder almost touching hers, sharing the weight the way they had shared everything else. They watched the sun climb higher, painting the city in shades of gold and amber, and neither of them spoke because words felt unnecessary, inadequate for what was building between them. This thing that was not romance exactly, but was recognition, partnership, two people who had survived erasure learning to exist in daylight. Inside the penthouse on the Vampire King's desk, half hidden under new paperwork and legal briefs and correspondence from allies checking in after the trial, a file marked separation law. Pending repeal sat waiting for attention, waiting for the work that came after survival, waiting for them to decide if exposing the council's corruption was enough or just the opening move in a longer game. The work was not done, would never be done. Because systems built on lies and maintained through violence did not collapse from a single trial, did not transform because 3 elders resigned, but now they were doing the work together. Now Mara had a partner who understood what it cost to fight power. Now the Vampire King had someone who saw him as more than a title, or a threat, or a relic of an older world. Mara felt the locket's weight in her hand and thought about the photograph inside, her and the Vampire King standing together, and she understood it was a promise, a declaration that they were bound now not by ancient law, but by choice, by the decision to face whatever came next, as allies rather than obligation, holder, and debtor. The sun climbed higher, and the city woke fully, traffic thickening and noise rising, and Mara breathed in rain-scrubbed air and let herself believe that maybe this was what her grandmother had meant when she said the Night King would have no choice. Maybe the old woman had understood that invoking the debt would give Mara more than shelter, would give her a place to stand, a voice that mattered, someone who would fight beside her rather than for her. The Vampire King's phone buzzed in his pocket, sharp and insistent, and he pulled it out with a frown that deepened when he saw the screen. Unknown number. Message from someone who should not have this contact information. 3 elders resigned, the text read, clinical and cold. 9 remain. We are not finished with you. The screen went dark, but the message hung in the air between them like smoke, like a promise of violence deferred rather than prevented, and Mara felt the hollow place in her chest fill with something harder, something that looked like determination. The council was wounded, but not destroyed, would regroup and retaliate, would find ways to punish them for exposing corruption and validating old laws and proving that the separation law was maintained through murder rather than necessity. But Mara had spent her whole life surviving systems designed to erase her, had learned to fight from a position of powerlessness, had claimed space in a council chamber, and lived to speak about it. And she was not afraid of 9 remaining elders, because fear was a luxury she had never been able to afford. The Vampire King looked at the message and then at Mara, and something passed between them without words, understanding that the fight was not over, that partial victory was just the beginning, that they had made enemies who would not rest until one side or the other was eliminated. But they would face it together, would meet whatever the council sent with the same partnership that had gotten them through the trial, would keep dragging truth into light until the lies could not hold, or until they were destroyed trying. Mara reached for the Vampire King's hand, and he took it without hesitation, fingers threading through hers, cold skin against warm, vampire and human standing together on a balcony, while the sun rose and the city breathed, and somewhere 9 council elders plotted revenge. The locket swung between them, catching light, the photograph inside a promise they had both chosen to keep, and Mara thought about Marie's words. About prices paid and debts deferred and the way some fights lasted generations because the alternative was surrender. She would not surrender, would not let the council erase her the way they had erased her family, would stand beside the Vampire King and fight for a world where the separation law was repealed, where vampires and humans could love without execution, where old pacts were honored rather than buried. The work was not done, but it had started, properly started. And that was enough for now, enough to build on, enough to justify the hollow feeling in her chest. Because hollow meant there was space for something new, something better, something that looked like hope if you squinted at it right. Dawn turned to full morning and they stayed on the balcony watching the city come alive, and when they finally went inside to face whatever came next, They went together, shoulder to shoulder, partners in a fight that had just begun.